Like, yeah, if Facebook were just an anarchist wasteland of free speech, quote unquote, then no one would want to be there. And no one would go there, and they wouldn't sell ads, and they wouldn't make money. And then
be like 4chan, probably.
yeah. Well, I mean, 4chan is literally
that's what that is.
Free
it's like,
speech advocates.
It's the old
Mecca.
West. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, seriously, go to 4chan.
Yeah,
you
go
want
to
to
4chan.
see you want to see what their interpretation of free speech looks like, go to 4chan.
Yeah.
It's a mess.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. My name is Patrick.
And I'm Brandon.
Yeah. So, what are we going to talk about today, Brandon?
Patrick, I think we're going to talk about free speech, aren't we?
That's
Everybody's
right.
favorite. Everybody's favorite.
This is a crazy. This topic is actually a lot bigger than I anticipated it to be when I was doing research, because there's just so much involved in it, like as far as like the legal history, as far as like the philosophical history and everything like that. So why don't I just start before I get into like the nitty gritty stuff and just ask you what your thoughts are on the whole idea behind free speech?
Yeah, so I think free speech is kind of a foundational part of society, because if people can't talk about things, then in like a free and open setting without interference by the powers that be it the government or the king or whatever it might be, you know, you're going to have serious issues and nothing's ever going to change.
Yeah. I agree with that. You know, I feel like I personally used to be much more of what you might call today like a free speech absolutist. Today, I still strongly believe in that. Like, I still strongly believe in free speech as a staple of democracy, and that it's if you don't have that, it's kind of hard to have any other value of democracy, you know? But I've kind of come around like to the idea that like if you do any sort of like cursory research, you'll learn pretty quickly that like you not every type of speech can be allowed. Like there are certain limitations.
Yeah.
And it would be kind of absurd to presume that you can just literally say anything anywhere you want, because that kind of thing is obviously just kind of absurd and ridiculous. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And honestly, that's kind of part of what I want to talk about, because when you have free speech in the context of the government or the whatever the powers that are ruling over the civilization are, you know, whatever we've all agreed to as a people, that's good, you know, being able to just speak your mind and stuff. But, and I think this is the differentiation that most people don't get, is there's also a social level to that, because you can say whatever you want, but there's a social expectation of consequences,
right?
You know, and I mean, this kind of goes into the whole punch a Nazi thing. Like, I obviously don't like perpetrate violence on other people.
Yeah.
But the expectation as a society should be that if you're a Nazi, you might get punched. You know, if you say horrible things, someone's gonna be angry with you for saying those things.
Right.
And that's, I think, the difference that most people don't recognize is, like, free speech, as far as the Constitution goes, is about the government, the most powerful people that are around, not imposing their will on people and bringing about, like, you know, thought crimes and speech crimes. Because if we aren't able to speak out against the government or whatever powers, then, you know, we lose our power as a people.
Right.
And free speech is kind of wrapped up in the heart of democracy.
Yes, and I think that's like an important point that a lot of people these days miss about free speech, is that it's a function of democracy. You know, because a lot of people who are right wing, who like yell all day about freedom of speech, also tend to be the same people who are like questionable about democracy, which kind of like frustrates me because it's like you don't understand that, like, well, let's assume that we live in a totally anarcho-capitalist world where everything is privately owned. So where do you have the freedom of speech in that world? You know what I'm saying? Like I could step outside, and as soon as I step onto someone else's property, that person can tell me what I can and can't say, no matter where I go. Right? As long as there's, I don't have freedom of speech on anyone else's property, and if private property dominates everything, there is no freedom of speech, except maybe in my own home. But like, what's the point of that? That's not freedom of speech. Like, the whole point of freedom of speech is to express yourself in a public setting somehow. You know what I'm saying?
Right, without fear of repercussion.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that was the major problems with all the great dictatorships of the world is throughout history is someone doesn't like what you say and you go to jail. Yeah. You know? And we live in a society where if someone doesn't like what you say, you might get fired or you might lose a friend or something. Yeah. But you aren't in like legal jeopardy. You aren't going to go to jail. You aren't going to be like taken to a Gestapo in the middle of Siberia. You know, and that's part of our democracy. But also we're a capitalist society. And actually, I was telling you, I just read this article about how Xbox is going to start, quote unquote, policing speech to make it more friendly towards all gamers, which I think is great. Because I don't like playing on Xbox Live because everyone's an asshole, you know?
Oh, man.
Like, those little 13-year-old kids, and it's like, dude, I just want to play my game, man.
Totally toxic people, like, all over the gaming world.
Right, exactly. And I mean, in our society, someone will probably come up with a place for those people, you know, who just want to talk shit all day. And that's okay, fine. I don't want to be a part of that, but they can. And the government, I don't think there should be government regulation on what can and can't be said inside a gaming chat room or something, you know? And okay, I got the First Amendment right here. The First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So that's nothing about that's all about being able to address public issues that affect the whole, not like, yeah, okay, great. Like, Jordan Peterson can be a dick and say horrible things. That's fine. But if a private company says you can't be here anymore, that's not a violation of his free speech rights.
Right.
If he were calling for the downfall of the Canadian government, and which, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what the free speech laws are in Canada, because I know for a fact, like, Australia doesn't have a First Amendment. Like, they don't have anything in their constitution that has anything to do with the freedom of speech.
It's a uniquely American value, I guess.
Exactly. And I think that most other, you know, developed nations just kind of take it for granted. Like, well, yeah, of course you can speak out against government. That's fine. That's kind of the whole point. And here we have all these like amendments and articles in the Constitution that we hold so dear and twist and turn into whatever we want it to be. And I mean, you read it plainly, and it literally, the first part of it is Congress shall make no law doing any of these things. So it has nothing to do with being deplatformed or being called an asshole or not being invited to the party because you say racist things. Like, that has nothing to do with your free speech. If Congress comes out and says, you can't say anything bad about either party as, you know, the opposite party, like,
you're not allowed to say fuck anymore.
Exactly. Like, that's literally against the law. That is like unconstitutional.
Right.
But if, you know, Xbox says you can't be a little prick on, and like trash talk people, then that has nothing to do with the government.
Right. There's a couple of things. I think that like freedom of speech does not mean that you are entitled to a platform to express that speech, apart from perhaps any sort of public infrastructure. And that's actually traditionally how the U.S. has interpreted the First Amendment. Like you said, it has nothing to do with what corporations say about what you can do on their platforms. Yeah. And you have to understand, I'm, pretty anti-capitalist. So like, I'm not pro-corporation by any means. And I do encourage people to express themselves freely. But when it comes to like just being a jerk or being a Nazi prick or just being like shitty to other people in some way, like that to me is not in the spirit of like what the First Amendment is supposed to be. Like I said, this is about freedom of speech is about democracy. It's about like how we discuss issues that we face in our society. Right. And it sucks because, Facebook is a huge platform. YouTube is a huge platform, Twitter, whatever. These are huge platforms. So, it is a little bit of a concern that like these corporations are going to like stamp down on certain types of speech. Mm-hmm. And they do stamp down on leftists. Actually, a lot of people don't know this. Leftists get censored just as much as people on the right wing. And I can show you examples of that. So the First Amendment has been interpreted to include only speech that is expressed on public land or in public buildings and infrastructure. This is essentially how the Supreme Court has always ruled. The First Amendment isn't designed to protect that speech that is expressed on private property that is not owned by you. Maybe it should be, but that's a separate discussion. A boss can fire you for whatever reason. If you say things that your boss doesn't like, your boss can fire you.
Right.
That's just like the First Amendment doesn't say anything about that.
Right. Yeah, and specifically right here, the people have the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Like, if the people are upset about something, a law or something, then they have the right to speak out against the government and their leaders, which our current administration would rather not have. And the press is specifically mentioned in the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And, so it's basically, you can say whatever you want about the government and the powers that be, which actually I did want to mention how like hate speech laws.
Yes, that's a big part of this.
Very different from they're not in any way opposing or going against the First Amendment, because that has nothing to do with the government.
Right.
Like, the whole purpose of the First Amendment is so that people have the ability to challenge things that they don't agree with as far as law goes. But laws are us as a society going, that's probably not a good thing for us all to do. So hate speech laws are good because they're saying we all don't want to run around just yelling nasty things to each other and murdering each other because they have a different skin color or like different genitalia than we do. And the First Amendment has nothing to do with any of that. And right. But you're right, like, people who twist it and take it to mean things that it doesn't mean and apply it in ways the words just aren't there. You can't change that or interpret that in any way that saying bad things and getting deplatformed by a corporation has any bearing on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, but the Supreme Court can change. We can change it if we wanted to. The First Amendment or the Constitution in general we can change that.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you have
what the First Amendment is.
Right. If you have a moral opposition to being deplatformed on a website like Facebook or whatever, you should change the Constitution because right. the Constitution doesn't deal with that. You should also kind of think about like what Facebook is as a corporation. If you want to have total free speech on Facebook and you want them to not police any of your speech on Facebook, you should be advocating to nationalize Facebook.
Right, exactly.
which I very much doubt any of these right-wing people would want to do, right? Because it's such it's so hypocritical in a way, because like a lot of these people, like I was going to get into this later, but like recently, you know, it was probably several months ago now, but like Alex Jones, Alex Jones was basically taken off the internet for all intents and purposes. And of course, Alex Jones being Alex Jones, you know, is going to go on his show, which he's only able to use on his website now, basically.
Yeah.
Goes on his show and whines and complains that he's being censored, right? And that his freedom of speech is being abridged or whatever.
Right.
And it's just like, Alex Jones, you're the person who's been like yelling about like being pro-capitalist and like businesses being able to do whatever they want for like a long fucking time now. So like you know, you get what you ask for, basically. Like, you know, I don't understand how you can hold, it seems like so cognitively dissonant to like hold these views in your head and it's not even be understood or recognized by these people. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And frankly, he's either stupid or he doesn't care. Because if the city had walked in, shut him down, been like, you can't do this anymore, you know, we don't like what you're saying, he could probably take that case to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because that's not what the government should be doing, local or otherwise. But it wasn't. It was all the people, all his sponsors and the people who were hosting his stuff and Twitter and YouTube who were just like, we don't want this here, you know, which like, yeah, if Facebook were just an anarchist wasteland of free speech, quote unquote, then no one would want to be there and no one would go there and they wouldn't sell ads and they wouldn't make money. And then
be like 4chan probably.
yeah. Well, I mean, 4chan is literally
that's what that is.
Free
it's like,
speech advocates.
It's the old
Mecca.
West. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, seriously, go to 4chan.
Yeah.
You want to see what their interpretation of free speech looks like? Go to 4chan.
Yeah.
It's a mess. It's awful. There's nothing good going on there. Nobody wants to be there. It's just literally trolls
and shit posting. That's all it is. Yeah,
exactly. And there's nothing of value there, so no one wants to go there. Mm-hmm. Versus, you know, if you're on Facebook and you see people posting, you know, videos of beheadings and Nazi propaganda and, you know, like bestiality and all that stuff, like, you aren't going to want to be there to look at your grandma's 80th birthday photos.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So, and that's what Facebook wants you to do. And that's their business model. And that's fine. Mm-hmm. Like, good for them. I don't want to see that shit there. That's the only reason I'm still on Facebook, is to see my grandmother's 80th birthday photos, you know?
Yeah.
And it's the idea that somehow people deciding that they don't like what you say is a violation of your speech, of your free speech rights, makes no sense, because take that all the way. I don't like things most people say, and if I tell them they can't do that and that's a violation of their free speech rights, we'd all be going to court all the time.
Yeah.
I know plenty of people I would take to court for violating my free speech rights, because you and I both have some far out there views as far as the mainstream's concerned. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we're allowed to do this. We're allowed to record a podcast and talk about how people don't understand what free speech is, and
yeah,
you know, and no one's gonna come knocking. Gestapo's not knocking down our door and telling us to shut it down, because we're allowed to do this. We can even talk about how shitty we think our current administration is, and how awful all the laws that are being passed right now are, or rather being blocked in the Senate. But
yeah, so if you're on the right and you think that, you know, if we were to like take hate speech and things like that more seriously, if you think that would be like a slippery slope towards like something more like what China is doing or something like that, well, I have bad news for you, because actually the Supreme Court in the United States has had a long history of trying to interpret the First Amendment, and setting limitations on it.
Yeah, which they just did recently.
What was that? What did they do recently?
So, actually, I think it was a couple days ago, the Supreme Court released a ruling. It was a 7-2 ruling on the Bladensburg Cross, which is like a bajillion foot high concrete cross and a median in the middle of a intersection in Bladensburg, Maryland. And it's like 40 feet tall. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation took it to the Supreme Court and basically said, this is a religious, monument on public land being maintained by public funds from the city. And the Supreme Court basically ruled it may have started out as a religious icon, but it's become secular, so it doesn't violate the First Amendment. And they cited like the Red Cross and like the cross of the like the medical, like Blue Cross Blue Shield and most medical foundations and stuff, and how it may have started out as a religious thing, but it's become secular, so it no longer violates the First Amendment, because the First Amendment, through many rulings of the court throughout the ages, has been interpreted as the government cannot like directly support a religion, which is what they're doing in effect. And the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 ruling, which is absurd, was just like, yeah, no, that's not how it works anymore. Like, they came this close to overturning the Lemon Law, which is basically you have to determine how much of the whatever the religious thing is being supported by the government. And if it doesn't reach a certain threshold, then, it's no good. You can't do that. And they basically were just like, yeah, not that anymore. It's just, we just decided it's not religious.
Yeah.
And
that's an interesting case. I haven't heard about that. I think that, that's actually quite a different type of scenario from something that, say, like prayer in schools. Because, that's sometimes the argument from conservatives is that, like, oh, I should be allowed to pray in schools because of the First Amendment, free speech, blah, blah, blah. But the problem with that is that the government hasn't made any laws restricting you from you yourself praying to and with yourself by yourself. That's not the issue with prayer in schools. The issue with prayer in schools are teachers who will bring their students together and force them to pray to whoever, if you're a Christian teacher or whatever, making your students pray to your Christian God, even if only some of your students are Christian.
Right.
Which that is a violation of the First Amendment.
Yeah, as are invocations at the beginning of city assemblies. That's just plain against the Constitution. That's unconstitutional.
It's unconstitutional to use public funds to promote any kind of religion over any other.
Yes.
And so it doesn't matter. Like, if you think that you're allowed to say stuff religious, you can, that's fine, but you can't force other people to follow that.
Right. And you can't use your position as a government employee, which is what public school teachers are, to further a religious agenda. Just like a teacher can't stand up and start playing Alex Jones stuff, they probably could, but that's not really how that works.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's fine. You can play whatever you want, but if you get fired, that's not imposing on your free speech rights.
Yeah.
If you were, as a teacher, talking to your which is, this is kind of, I guess, gray area, but if you were, as a teacher, were talking to your students and saying, the Trump administration is super shitty and they're ruining our country and all this stuff, and you got fired for saying that, let's say they're high school students, you'd probably have a case there because you're speaking out against the government and the government fired you.
Yeah.
Or even bring it down to a teacher talking shit on the school administration, And being like, they need to give you guys better lunches, and they need to give you guys more free time to study what you want to study, and they aren't doing it, and they're awful for that, and you get fired for that. Like, you're allowed to speak out against government entities.
Yeah.
Even
absolutely.
as a government employee.
So I want to go back to this history that the United States has of limiting free speech, and there was one interesting case. I wrote down a couple of different Supreme Court cases, but I want to talk about this one in particular because it's interesting. It's called U.S. versus Schenck in 1917. Schenck was a guy who basically protested the draft in 1917, which I guess would have been the draft for World War I. Mm-hmm. And he would go out in public streets and hand out pamphlets and have signs and stuff, protesting the draft, saying, fucking don't draft me because that's bullshit and I don't want to go die in a war, right. And you would think that the government would actually favor him, or at least would interpret his case as being in the spirit of the First Amendment. However, they ruled against him, and the reason for that was basically he was basically arrested and charged under the Espionage Act.
What?
Yeah, it was deemed that this speech could have a direct negative impact on the war effort. And believe it or not, this is where the whole idea of yelling fire in a crowded theater thing comes from. You know what that is? Yeah. So Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, basically came up with that. He's like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, which makes perfect sense. That's not free speech. You are directly inciting people to panic. Right. And so he drew a line between that and someone protesting the draft, which is ridiculous, obviously. But that's what I mean about if you think there's a slippery slope going on, it's been a long slippery slope.
Oh yeah, well, and I mean I think that's kind of the great part and the worst part of democracy, and especially our legal system, because it's based on the Constitution and the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. And that's great because we've come so far from where we were. Slavery is now illegal in the United States. That's a huge step, But I mean, literally anybody can just go buy an assault weapon. So that's also bad. And also the government can now apparently give money to churches to repurpose their playgrounds over public schools, like in Missouri, and can now just be yeah, no, that's not a religious icon. We're just going to spend a few, I think it's $40,000 a year in upkeep on this thing in the Bladensburg Cross. And it goes both ways, but that's honestly, I'm fine with that because it will swing back and forth.
Yeah.
And I mean, it takes generations now because the Supreme Court is a mess.
Yeah.
For
man.
At least the next 30 years. Hooray.
Who knows how long it's going to be a mess for, honestly.
But I'm fine with that because, even Neil Gorsuch isn't going to be yeah, Alex Jones should be allowed to say whatever the hell he wants to say. Facebook, YouTube, the internet. You have to platform him. You have to give him a platform.
I think they're going to rule in favor of corporations pretty much 100% of the time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Any judge is going to be go screw yourself, dude.
Yeah.
If people don't like what you say, they don't have to, give you a place to say it. You can go out in the middle of the street and say it. We aren't going to stop you. And we have passed laws you need to register for a permit for a rally or a protest or something like that. And if you want to counter protest something, you have to register for that as well. Because we have, as a society, decided, yeah, you can say whatever you want, but we don't want you just doing it anywhere all the time. And we don't want you being violent. So you can protest and gather wherever you want, whenever you want. But if it's going to impact the rest of us, we want to at least be yeah, sure. Well, we can expect it at this time. And that's why we had those laws.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. So I wanted to also talk about, you brought up Jordan Peterson earlier. I wanted to talk about him because pretty much the whole reason that he became so famous on the internet was because he protested a bill in Canada that would have Well, let's just go with what he claimed it would have done. The bill would have made it to where if you were to misgender someone, or misgender someone who's transgendered or whatever, you would get fined and possibly go to jail. But of course, all of the legal experts looked at this bill, Bill C-16, I think.
Yeah.
And said, no, it really all it does is just add transgender people to the list of protected classes of people for civil rights.
Right.
That's all it does.
Right.
And it was also already the law in many Canadian provinces.
I think it was
at the
all
time.
the provinces.
Yeah, that's why it's so ridiculous that he got so bent out of shape out of that. And he was like, well, I'm not going to follow this law. I'm like, so you're just going to be a jerk and go around and just be like, misgender people left and right like
right,
that.
Exactly.
That's called being a shitty person. Just treating people like shit. Don't do that.
Right.
That's
He's still allowed to do that.
right. No, no one has gotten arrested for this.
Right.
It passed. C-16 passed.
Exactly.
No one's gotten arrested. Yeah. No one's even been fined, I don't think.
And see, that's the argument that Peterson and his followers, including my parents, unfortunately, have argued and I mean, this is connected to the whole free speech issue. They're calling it compelled speech because and that is a violation of, free speech rights, is saying you have to think and talk this way. To be fair, that's what authoritarian governments do. You aren't allowed to talk about the dude who the dictator just murdered. He doesn't exist anymore. You can't talk about it. But that's compelled speech. Compelled speech is not you can't fire somebody for, being transgender or, you can be an asshole all you want. You can dead name them. You can use their, use everything but their preferred pronouns. You can do that. You aren't going to get fired for it. And if somebody does fire you for it, that's not a violation of your free speech rights.
Right.
If you're a government employee and you get fired for being an asshole, that's not a violation of your free speech rights. You're just an asshole.
Right. And that's really what the bill was about. It was about protecting people from housing discrimination, job discrimination, and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
It has nothing to do with you saying things.
Right, exactly.
But this is how he got famous, and he's like a millionaire from Patreon now. This was the thing that brought him to the big time, basically.
Yeah. And that is frankly because people don't understand what free speech is. They don't recognize that. I mean, and I'll be honest, I didn't really give a shit or know much about what free speech was until a few years ago.
Yeah.
Because it was just one of those things that it's you can, you can't be stopped from saying things, you aren't going to go to jail for saying bad things or speaking out against the government. And that was just that's how I learned it in middle school. And then Jordan Peterson and his ilk come along and it's okay, so you think that people not liking what you say is a violation of your free speech rights. So we all have to be okay with anybody saying anything. Where does that lead, man? Really?
Yeah.
And read the amendment. It's 3 sentences long. It says nothing about that.
Yeah.
It's the government, Congress can't pass a law that says you can't speak out against the government. They have to allow you to petition the government. And that's why we have our representatives in town halls where you can just walk in and be like, dude, I hate everything you're doing. You're awful. Right, you can do that and the police won't drag you out.
Yes,
as long as you aren't throwing anything at them.
And another interesting situation that's been going on recently was Steven Crowder. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with Steven Crowder at all?
Is he
He's on YouTube and he has a show. He's conservative dude. He's
thinking of somebody else. I'm thinking of some old Christian.
The Change My Mind meme. The picture of the guy behind the the desk outside and it says whatever change my mind. Yeah. That's Steven Crowder.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But he's a super right wing radio show, YouTube show host. But anyway, so what happened with him was for a while, I guess, there was a few times that he kind of made fun of gay people and stuff on his show. In particular, this person, Carlos Menza, who's I'm not sure. I think he works for Vox. And he does.
Oh yeah. I actually watch his stuff a lot.
Yeah. So Steven Crowder like made fun of him and stuff, and Steven Crowder also like wears a shirt on his show and also sells the shirt at his store that shows a picture of Che Guevara, and it says socialism is for F*G.
Awesome.
S. So I'm not gonna say that on recording, and it shows like Che Guevara like being all like, you know, dainty, effeminate. Like, so what happened was basically he got just demonetized from YouTube.
Yeah.
So his videos don't make money anymore.
Yeah.
And guess what? He did the same thing Alex Jones did, and basically said that he's being censored and that his free speech is being abridged.
Absurd.
You're not entitled to get paid by YouTube, dude. Like,
right.
like if they don't like what you're doing, they could kick you off. Like,
Exactly. And you know what? Like, I watch plenty of channels on YouTube specifically of, you know, sex educators and like people who do like really weird shit and make like, you know, How To Basic.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
He was demonetized at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Why?
Have you watched his videos?
They're insane.
Crazy.
Yeah, they're insane.
Yeah. And it's just people are like, I don't like this. Those videos were getting reported.
Yeah, well, I can kind of understand that because...
Yeah, but, you know, How To Basic and, you know, Dan Savage and any other person who's like doing things, they're like, yeah, I know, I'm probably going to lose money on this, you know? Or like people who are running like atheist or skeptical YouTube channels and being like, so I'm going to talk about how awful this religion is. I know it's going to get demonetized. You know, they're like okay with it because they know what they're saying.
Well, here's the thing. Like, I do that. It is a concern of mine. Like, I don't want to like pretend like that everything that corporations do with regards to how they manage who gets paid and who doesn't get paid or who gets to use their platform or not. It can be a huge problem. It's just the hypocrisy of the conservative side of things that really like bugs me because it kind of like poisons the well in many ways, you know, and makes it to where we can't have a serious conversation about, you know, possibly passing some laws to protect people on the internet who rely on it for income or whatever. Just, you know, because I know that people get demonetized just from reporting the news and things like that. So it's like, yeah, like that. I don't think that should happen. Like, you know, we need to like do something to fix that. And one of the problems is YouTube is so big. There's like how many hours every second? Like 300 hours are posted to YouTube every second. That like there is no way that they could ever like monitor all of that. So like, you know, you'll get struck with DMCA claims and things like that, and like it can be a problem, and I think we need to address it. But it's just
but it has nothing to do with free speech. That's the thing.
Yes,
like that has to do with how we regulate our economy.
Exactly. Yeah,
and that is not that has literally nothing to do with free speech, because free speech is about read the First Amendment. You know, it has nothing to do with how we decide we want our economy to work and the people that employ us we don't have town squares anymore. We have Facebook. No one's walking through the streets being like, hear ye. Like, the government's awful, burn it all to the ground. Like, no one's doing that. They're doing it on Facebook. They're doing it on Twitter. Right. You know, they're making YouTube videos and putting them out there, and people are watching them, and they're getting demonetized because people don't like what they say. And YouTube's like, fine, we won't give that guy any money. We'll take his videos down, you know? And I'm all for the democratic policing of our own speech as a society. Like I said, I'm not for punching Nazis, but I think Nazis should expect to be punched. Like the social expectation.
I'm for punching Nazis.
It's
a tongue in cheek, but
yeah, you know, I'm not gonna. If someone is standing next to me and someone else says something racist and they get punched, I'm not gonna be like, shame on you.
Yeah,
you had it coming. You had it coming. Yeah, and if we want to make America great again, let's go back to the time when you said something shitty and your dad took his belt off and beat you to death. You know, like the social expectation should be that you're going to get in trouble if you say things that are not socially acceptable. And that should extend to our digital lives as well. And we need to, like, frankly, I think we need to start working on passing laws that address that specifically. But again, that has nothing to do with free speech.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the philosophical side of things, which I mean,
I want to know where free speech comes from.
You know, I there's a lot of resources online. The biggest person in like Western philosophy to talk about free speech is John Stuart Mill. You know, he was a very like hardcore free speech advocate, but a huge part of his philosophy was like trying to understand like what the limits of free speech are. So we can start with talking about the fact that like you can have certain kinds of clashes of speech acts. So like, for example, like if I were to go out onto a public road and start protesting or whatever, and then someone else comes out onto the road and starts protesting me, and then we start yelling over each other, that's not really conducive to the spirit of free speech. So, you know, there are certain types of speech that can affect the speech of other people, is kind of the point there. John Stuart Mill's thing is basically what he calls the harm principle, which is basically like, you know, we shouldn't allow any type of speech that can be demonstrated to directly cause harm. So
Right.
It goes back to kind of like the, you know, yelling or shouting fire in a crowded theater thing. If you're directly inciting panic or something like that, then obviously that doesn't fall under the purview of the principle of real free speech. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, in my opinion, the harm principle can be applied to hate speech. It's a little bit more complicated than something like yelling fire in a crowded theater, but it's still the same kind of thing, because what you're essentially doing is, if you get up into someone's face, if like say it's, you know, an African American individual and a white guy is yelling the N-word, you are intentionally, knowingly trying to upset that person, and knowing and intentionally trying to incite that person to act in a way that may not, you know, it obviously isn't going to turn out well. Like if you do something like that. There's also the issue of like when these kinds of attitudes, certain kinds of like fascist right-wing attitudes that kind of categorize people as being less than whatever, you know, if you're if you're a white supremacist, you know, what you're doing when you try to spread those ideas is you're actively trying to suppress the free speech of those lower peoples. That's what I mean when it's my opinion that like there's nothing that violates the First Amendment about trying to regulate fascist style hate speech. You know what I'm saying? Because like you are actively trying to silence another group of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, that's kind of the whole point of free speech, is so that people who are marginalized and, you know, disadvantaged in our society can do something about it. They can talk about it, you know, and if you're trying to stop them from doing that, you're violating their free speech rights. And I mean, it could be argued that not actively giving them the opportunity to do that is violating their free speech rights, which, you know, voter suppression and all that kind of stuff.
Are you at all worried that, like, because one of the arguments that you see thrown around is that if you silence or censor certain types of speech, that speech will quote unquote fester in the dark? I mean, do you have any like concerns about that? Like, I just want to know what you think about that.
Oh, you mean like saying that's hate speech, you can't say that?
No, what I'm saying is like if like let's say like we as a society successfully censor all hate speech, which obviously is not going to happen, but if we were to like eliminate the Nazi rhetoric from public discourse altogether, like some people will say, oh, well then, you know, there'll be no platform for their ideas to be challenged. So they will just talk to each other like in the dark, and it'll spread in the dark. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I think that's what happened. I think that that's what happened throughout the 90s and the early 2000s is I was one of them. I was like, the rest of us good people, I guess, were like, oh yeah, racism, that's like, I mean, yeah, there are racists out there, but nobody talks about it.
Yeah.
You know, they're just assholes. And then along comes Trump, who just throws it right out there in the middle of everywhere. And then we literally have Nazis marching in the street next thing we know. Like, they call themselves Nazis. Yeah. And, I mean, that was a shock to me because I knew people who had slightly racist tendencies, you know? Like, and, I mean, I'll freely admit, I have racist tendencies because of the society I grew up in, like the way I was raised.
If you don't recognize that racism is an institutional problem,
not an individual one.
Not even so much an individual one. I mean, it's an individual problem too, but like everyone is like a little bit racist. There's some like musical where it's like everyone's a little bit racist or something like that. I don't know where that comes from. Someone told me about it. Everyone's a little bit racist. Like even it's been demonstrated in studies that even African Americans think of themselves as being
through a racist lens.
Yeah, they're racist towards themselves in some ways. So it's. Yeah, like you need to recognize that it's an institutional problem and that we all have these kinds of biases in us, you know, like unconscious biases.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean that's just the way the human brain works, you know.
Right.
But
it's important to recognize that. Like that's the whole point of like speaking out against racism is to recognize that we all have this. And if you're one of those people who's like, well, I'm not racist, like, yeah, right. Yeah, come on, man. Like, come on. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. Those are the people who are most likely to be racist, in my opinion.
Well, and honestly, like, I felt that way for a very long time. I was like, I'm not racist, you know. And then I'd lock my car doors while I was driving through East Baltimore, you know, because I mean, it's a bad neighborhood, and I didn't realize that the reason I thought it was a bad neighborhood was because of the people who live there and the color of their skin. And I mean, yes, it can be a bad neighborhood in parts, but that's, you know, that wasn't that bias was already like instilled in me from a young age and all around me. You know, it's in TV shows, it's everywhere. Yeah. And me not recognizing that, I think made me blind to the fact that all those people were growing in the shadows, you know, maybe not growing, but they were all still there. And, you know, they were talking to each other, but the social expectation was you might get hit if you talk about this shit in public. And then a powerful person came along with a national platform and said the things that those people were thinking and saying to themselves. And they thought, he's saying it on national television and he's not getting punched. He's not getting deplatformed or whatever, you know, like he's not being punished for it. So I can say those things. And I mean, just look at the data. There's been a huge spike in hate crimes since 2016.
Yeah.
Like massive amount.
Yeah.
Like unprecedented.
It's really fucked up.
It really is. And I really want to get back to a place where Nazis are afraid.
Yes.
You know, but I don't know what to do when we get there. Because honestly, I don't know how I feel about giving people like that a quote unquote platform.
Right.
You know, because I do think that those ideas need to be addressed, but I'm not necessarily sure that they need to be addressed directly to the people who have them.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we can talk about those things and we can talk about white supremacy and racism and, you know, Islamophobia. And we can talk about all those things without having to talk to the people who are that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about it that way, but I think that's a good point.
Because, I mean, I told you earlier, I'm really good at playing devil's advocate. I can definitely make a case for being Islamophobic, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I can easily do that. Like, and I can also make a case for being really racist because you know it's not that complicated logic and it's broken logic, but I can see how people can get there. So I can it's not that difficult to have a conversation about racism and be like, well, you probably feel this way. Well, yeah. Well, okay. Well, you're probably validated in feeling this way because of like A, B, and C. And someone might go, yeah, actually, yeah. And it's not that difficult to say, well, did you think about it this way? You know, and you don't have to have somebody shouting racial slurs and, you know, tying their red laces up to be saying those things for a conversation about it to be effective.
Right. So we're coming up on close to an hour. Let's get some final thoughts in about how to actually like address that kind of thing. How to address like the rise of Nazism. Sorry,
Yeah.
that was my PlayStation.
Yeah, I think.
How do you combat like bad ideas like that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Honestly, I'm still trying to figure that out. Like, I am on a mission, and I know this is an unrealistic goal, but, you know, I'm shooting for the stars, hoping to hit the moon. I'm on a mission to be able to change people's minds about what
me
they
too.
believe.
Me too.
You know, and I know that's not you know, it's not a realistic goal, but I want to be able to engage people on their bad ideas and not have them, you know, because I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. When someone challenges something that you hold dear and, you know, you shut up, like you close down and you fight back. And I want to be able to have a conversation with somebody and understand why they believe these bad things, you know?
Yeah, you know what? I agree with you, and I even wrote down here, like, we need to be aware of the material conditions that made this type of thing happen. And that's really what it comes down to, is that, you know, a lot of Trump supporters were poor working class people who were seeing their life like slip away from them, you know, people who work in the coal mines and blah, blah, blah. Like that stuff's going away. Like the whole rural 50s lifestyle is disappearing and they're scared, you know, and maybe rightfully so. You know, it doesn't give them an excuse to be hateful, but it's like, you know, fertile territory for a, you know, horrible, you know, dictator to come in and, you know, take advantage of that, you know?
Yeah, which is exactly what's happened throughout history.
Yeah.
You know, and I firmly believe that, you know, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And me personally, I'm an avid history buff. Like I love reading about things, and especially dictators and, you know, failed empires and things like that. Like I want to learn about that. I want to learn what they did right, what they did wrong, because it's never black and white when it comes to that stuff, but we can learn a lot from them. We can learn to recognize things. Like there's for years now, there's been a thing going around about the 7 stages of genocide and how we're on like step 5. Like,
we're geez.
Fomenting hatred and fear of the other. And, you know, and it's not the Jews or the blacks or, you know, it's everybody now.
Yeah.
So we're like taking it to 11.
Yeah. And I mean, it is clearly getting really bad. I mean, obviously, you know, immigration's been in the news recently with the detention centers, AKA concentration camps.
Yes.
And
that's a whole other conversation.
The fact that was like a controversy, like bringing that, it was AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm glad I got that name right because I can never pronounce it right. But she came out and said, hey, these are concentration camps. And then everyone was freaking out, being like, no, they're not. Like, they're just posturing, you know, and it's meaningless. But it's like, why are you arguing over this? First of all, like these things do meet the definition of concentration camps. Yeah. So, and
it's
then
camp with
second
concentration of people.
Yeah. Being held against their will by armed guard. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, they're concentration camps. You know, they're similar to the internment camps of the Japanese, and yes, to the Jews in Germany.
They're the same facilities.
Yeah. So like, and that's the conversation that the you know, these people want to have is like, well, are these aren't really concentration camps? It's like people don't want to admit that their own country is turning into this. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're in denial. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And I think that. I mean, bringing it all back around, I think the fact that we can say, like, these are concentration camps and not get arrested and not be shut down or anything is that's great.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome.
That's definitely like in the spirit of what is meant by freedom of speech.
Exactly. And I mean, it's completely different from Alex Smith or
Alex Jones.
Yeah. Yes. I'm really glad I forgot his name.
Yeah.
That was very satisfying.
By the way, the whole reason that Alex Jones got deplatformed was because he literally incited people to make violent threats against the parents of Sandy Hook victims.
That's exactly what I was saying. That's
Yeah.
that's awful.
Exactly.
That's not.
Should we defend
free
that?
speech.
That's not free
Yes,
speech.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you know what? I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna say that we're keeping children in concentration camps.
Yeah,
and
I'm gonna say that. Fuck you. Those are
yeah.
concentration camps.
And that the Trump administration is pulling the greatest Ponzi scheme ever and like straight up stealing from the American people, and that fuck Mitch McConnell.
You're right.
And I'm gonna say that stuff.
Yeah.
And if some podcast platform or something says, well, we don't want to have this on our platform anymore, fine, whatever, that's fine. If the government comes and tries to shut me down for saying that, they're gonna have a fight on their hands.
Oh yeah,
that's challenging my free rights, or free speech rights. But that's kind of the whole point of all of this, is that if you say shitty things that people disagree with, they don't have to listen to you.
Right.
And if you speak out against the government, you're allowed to do that. That's basically what it all comes down to.
Yes. So, that's perfect. We'll end on that. All right. To anyone out there who's listening, thanks for listening. See you later.